On the 27th of September, 1913, tens of thousands of Australians crowded the picturesque shorelines of Sydney Harbour. They gathered to witness one of the pivotal moments in the nation's history, the birth of the Royal Australian Navy. Freshly constructed in British shipyards, manned primarily by Australians and flying the Australian flag, the arrival of the brand new fleet in Sydney announced the emergence of the country as a truly independent nation-state, one that existed not only in name, but was now manifesting itself on the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. At the head of the new fleet steamed the magnificent battlecruiser HMAS Australia. At 180 metres long and displacing over 22,000 tonnes at full load, the 12-inch guns of HMAS Australia were a powerful symbol of both the nation's desire to invest in its own defence and the value it placed on the sea. Investing in an indefatigable class battlecruiser was an indication of just how much sea power was fundamental to the nation's security, even at that very early stage in the history of the Australian military. It instantly made Australia the dominant regional military power. As impressive as the new fleet was, complete with its cruisers and big gun capital ship, it was by no means an indication that Australia was able to provide for its own security. The RAN may have been the dominant naval force in Oceania and Southeast Asia, but compared to the fleets and militaries of any great power, Australia was, in reality, little more than a minor nation. Although always disproportionately wealthy, the country's relatively small population limited its military potential. As an example, in 1914, Australia's population was just over 4 million, less than 10% that of Great Britain. Until 1942, Australia saw itself as an explicitly British nation, and ties of culture, kinship, and national identity inexorably drove Australian foreign policy towards a deep integration with London, one that was only aided by Australia's place within the economic bloc that was the British Empire. Nonetheless, even considering these deep ties, the simple reality was that Australia lacked the military potential to defend itself effectively against a great power. As impressive as the new fleet was, in all practical reality, it was simply a fleet unit of the Royal Navy, and was thus intended to be part of a much more powerful whole. For the first half-century of the nation's existence, Canberra's strategic policy revolved around the support of a wider global order, of which Australia was a part, the British Empire. Britain was the world's preeminent global naval power, and Australia's geography has always meant that the only major strategic threats the nation can face have to be able to project their power across the ocean. Therefore, alliance with Britain not only underwrote Australia's physical security, but ensured the nation's prosperity. Australia's wealth is built upon exporting the nation's vast natural riches, which requires access to the oceans, the highways of global commerce. This was only amplified by the privileged economic status Australia enjoyed within the empire, guaranteeing local producers access to the massive British consumer market. Thus, Australia's security and prosperity were founded upon its place within a larger alliance structure and global order, and it was with the defence of that global order in mind that the nation's young men and women went to fight a war half a world away in 1914 and 1939. Australia's geostrategic position was founded upon Britain's global dominance, and thus Canberra would fight to ensure Britain remained the world's greatest naval power. Australia's global geostrategic outlook was shocked to its core by the events of 1942. For the first time in its history, the nation was faced with military defeat, isolation, and potentially invasion by one of the world's great naval powers, Imperial Japan. Not only that, but Canberra's security guarantor and patron, Great Britain, was embroiled in its own fight for national survival with Nazi Germany, and was both unwilling and unable to allocate significant resources to Australia's defence. It was in the dark days of 1942 that Australia forged a new strategic partnership, an alliance that was built upon the victories won in the bloody Papuan battlefields. Australia's relationship with the United States began in 1908, where tens of thousands crowded the nation's shorelines to witness the majestic Great White Fleet make its world tour, and American naval power would be welcomed just as warmly in 1942. Although Australia's army may have played the dominant role in the Papuan theatre during 1942 and 1943, it is unequivocal that the nation's physical security was ensured by the sailors of the United States Navy and their bravery at battles such as Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. With the end of the war, Canberra's relationship with London was forever changed. The United States had irrevocably replaced Great Britain as Australia's primary security partner, a relationship solidified with the ANZUS alliance. Canberra was still committed to aiding UK-led operations, as can be seen in the Malayan emergency, but its strategic fortunes were now well and truly entangled with Washington's. The strategic doctrine adopted by Australia between 1951 and 1976 was a concept called forward defence, aimed specifically at combating the spread of global communism in Asia. Australia's neighbours were now only beginning to enjoy the fruits of independence, but generally speaking were crippled by the social, cultural and economic damage inflicted by their colonial past. Many were vulnerable to communist insurgency. Although both the main alliance partner and the main enemy had changed, the fundamental strategy remained the same. The Australian military would be optimised and structured for out-of-area operations designed to support the United States in Asia. The Navy, built around the Majestic-class aircraft carriers Melbourne and Sydney, was designed to provide task forces to aid the operations of the US 7th Fleet. Although some presence was maintained in the nation's north, most of the Army and Air Force were based around the population centres. Just as Australia had fought wars in Europe to support Great Britain, so would it send the nation's fighting men and women to fight with America in Asia. This is no better exemplified by Australia's decade-long commitment to the Vietnam War. Over 500 Australians gave their lives in the jungles of Vietnam, and Canberra's prosecution of the war had to be supported by the introduction of conscription, a highly divisive political issue. Many have characterised Australia's strategy of military support for its alliance partners as a kind of brownie point accumulation. The conception that by helping our great and powerful friends in their wars, Australia can accumulate a stock of goodwill, one that can be cashed in if we are ever in trouble. Although this idea is not untrue, it is a very elementary characterisation of the forward defence strategy. Firstly, there is no guarantee that a more powerful nation will come to Australia's aid simply because they owe us, especially if it means compromising their own security. It seems apparent, given his actions in 1942, that Churchill would have been willing to sacrifice Australia to the Japanese if doing so maintained Britain's position in the war with Germany. Australia supports its great and powerful friends because, fundamentally, our security is underwritten by their global position. As part of a larger whole, Australia can hope to shape global geopolitics in a manner it simply could not do alone, and this is a feature of Australian grand strategy that is as present today as it was in 1914. A fundamental shift occurred in 1976. In the early 1970s, Australia's two major allies were disengaging from Asia. Britain, under the Wilson government, announced that all British forces would be withdrawn from the area east of Aden, effectively signalling London's strategic disinterest with the Indo-Pacific. Perhaps more importantly, with the end of the Vietnam War, the United States began a major pivot back to Europe. Called the Guam Doctrine, this new policy outlined Washington's unwillingness to support allies who did not make a meaningful effort to provide for their own security. Although clearly aimed at powers like South Vietnam, this assertion certainly made an impact in Australia. Finally, with the normalisation of relations between Washington and Beijing, the fear of communist insurgency had effectively been removed. For the first time in the country's history, it was decided that the defence of the Australian continent itself would be the responsibility of the Australian military. The nation now had the military potential, especially in population and GDP, to make the defence of Northern Australia by the Australian military alone a realistic possibility, at least in most scenarios. Although Canberra still expected significant American aid in the event of a large-scale military conflict, the primary responsibility for the defence of the Australian landmass would rest upon Australia alone. This new strategic vision was outlined in the 1976 Defence White Paper. Titled Australian Defence, this document realigned Australia's force structure and procurement aspirations. It declared that Australia no longer based its defence policy on the expectation that its Navy, Army or Air Force would be sent abroad to fight as part of some other nation's force. For the first time in the nation's history, the Australian military would be structured and equipped to operate in and around Australia itself. To signify this new self-reliant military posture, the military was now renamed the Australian Defence Force. Australia is an island nation, and this maritime geography automatically restricts the kinds of capability that realistically poses a strategically significant threat. In any conflict with Australia, a 100-division army is useless if it cannot be projected across the ocean. Therefore, any enemy has to gain control of the sea and air to the north of Australia if its land forces are ever going to pose a major strategic threat. It is this elemental feature of warfare, the fact that amphibious operations rely upon sea control, that is the basis for Australia's fundamental defensive strategy. In order to effectively defend the nation, the ADF does not need to maintain control of the ocean itself, it simply needs to deny that control to the enemy. Thus, this geography provides a substantial defensive benefit. If the ADF can effectively contest this area of maritime geography to its north, called the sea-air gap by Australian military planners, then even superior land powers would not pose an existential threat to the continent. This wider strategy was called the Defence of Australia Doctrine. The Defence of Australia Doctrine, as it would later become known, was based around three major capabilities, all of which had to be developed. The first was a wide area surveillance system. After all, if you don't know where a hostile naval force is, you cannot strike it. Australia faces a surveillance challenge that is unique, perhaps with the sole exception of Canada. As an island nation that is significantly larger than the continental United States, Australia has a vast stretch of coastline to cover, and the sea-air gap is almost 3,000 kilometres in length, not including the northern approaches to Australia's eastern seaboard. Compounding this challenge is the lack of population centres and infrastructure in the north. Conventional radar would require a massive investment and would only provide maritime surveillance over a distance of a few dozen nautical miles. The first capability that was acquired in the 1970s to address this challenge was the P-3C Orion maritime patrol aircraft. Although a vital addition, the surveillance footprint generated by a single MPA is certainly limited. To address this unprecedented surveillance challenge, the ADF looked to innovative new technology, over-the-horizon radar. Originally developed in the Soviet Union and United States, skywave radars leverage the tendency of high-frequency radio waves to be refracted by the atmosphere. This phenomenon is particularly acute in an electrically charged layer called the ionosphere. This allows a radar to see well over the horizon by bouncing radio waves off this area of the upper atmosphere, which can potentially give the system a range in excess of 3,000 kilometers. Nevertheless, the technological challenges this kind of radar poses are immense. Although early Soviet and American radars were basically successful, they suffered from serious discrimination and resolution issues. Skywave systems generate vast amounts of raw data. The propagation paths through the atmosphere are extremely complex, and a near real-time map of ionospheric conditions is required to calibrate the system. These challenges are why this technology has, generally speaking, only seen limited development internationally. Despite these technological risks, in 1972 the Defence Science and Technology Organisation began research and development into over-the-horizon systems, and by 1974 Project Jindalee was officially approved. Jindalee is a multi-static radar network, with transmitters and receivers separated by hundreds of kilometres. An initial radar station was constructed at Mount Everend near Alice Springs, at which, for some 30 years, extensive research and development was conducted. The greatest technological advances made by Australian science were in the area of signal processing. JORN requires a supercomputer to analyse the incoming data stream. There are quite literally rooms full of processors that are dedicated to signal analysis. The application of new software and commercial processing hardware allowed for order of magnitude improvements in resolution and discrimination over American and Soviet systems. Dramatic capability improvements were achieved. After a visit to the JORN Operations Centre in the late 1990s, the CEO of the Power and Water Authority in the Northern Territory, Owen Peake, recalled, "In the control room, I was looking over the shoulder of a young operator who obviously has immense regard for the system. He said, 'Look at this,' as an image appeared on the monitor. I can tell you that that is a Boeing 747 taking off from Changi Airport in Singapore, but unfortunately, I can't tell you which airline owns it. Singapore is over 4,000 kilometers from the transmitter. This capability was demonstrated before Dawn became operational, and certainly does not represent the technological state of the system today. Building upon the success of the Alice Springs radar, a wider complex was constructed. Handed over to the ADF in 2003 and more than 30 years in the making, the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, or JORN, contains 2 dedicated transmitter stations with their accompanying receivers, 7 transponders, and 12 vertical ionosons distributed around Australia and its territories. The 2 military transmitters are located in Longreach, Queensland and Laverton, Western Australia. The Laverton installation has a 180-degree field of view and, although currently the Longreach facility is limited to 90 degrees, this will be extended to 180 by 2025. The Alice Springs radar is still retained for research and development, although it can be patched into the system if required. As the radar beams can take uncertain propagation paths through the atmosphere, it can be difficult to know with certainty what exact location on the Earth's surface is being observed. To adjust for this uncertainty, 7 transponders are distributed around Australia's north. These can be observed by the radar itself, allowing for instant calibration, largely eliminating this problem. A real-time map of the ionosphere over Australia is generated by vertical ionosons, which observe ionospheric conditions. All of this raw data is then transmitted to the Dawn Coordination Centre at RAAF Edinburgh in Adelaide. Here, entire rooms full of processors take this massive flow of raw input and generate a tactical picture, which is then data linked to ADF Operational Command. All of these facilities are connected by dedicated fibre optic communications. Dawn is a capability of serious strategic value. Indeed, it is a truly impressive Australian technological achievement. As just a small indication of its capability, the network can detect and track aircraft and ships over an area of approximately 13 million square kilometres, nearly twice the size of Australia itself. One would be on very firm grounds making the claim that it is the most capable and advanced radar network operational anywhere in the world, capability that took nearly 5 decades of national endeavour to achieve. With Dawn, the first element of the Defence of Australia doctrine had been realised. The second major step on the road to self-reliance was the Collins-class submarine. In some ways Australia's F-35, the Collins-class is perhaps one of the most poorly understood military programs in the nation's history. Collins was a hugely ambitious project for Australian defence industry. The submarine was intended, from its outset, to be amongst the most capable diesel-electric submarines ever made, which is quite a high bar for a nation that had never built a submarine before. Essentially an enlarged Gotland class, Collins took a highly successful Swedish submarine design and supersized it, giving the boat almost unparalleled range and submerged endurance. With a submerged displacement of 3,400 tons, at its launch HMAS Collins was the largest modern conventional submarine ever built. Equipped with the same heavyweight torpedoes as used by US nuclear submarines and the Virginia-class's combat system, the BYG-1, the offensive capacity of the class is substantial. Even in their middle to late age, the Collins remains one of the most effective conventional submarines operational anywhere in the world. But this is not the class's reputation amongst the general public. Much like the F-35, early troubles with the program gained the Collins a reputation as a problematic and ineffective platform. The program was plagued by cost overruns and delays, probably something to be expected for a nation that had never built a submarine before. Making matters worse was the Collins' reliability, which, during the first decade of operational service, was so bad that only one of the 6-boat fleet was operational at any given time. Although availability improved dramatically in the 2010s, outperforming international benchmarks by 2016, the Collins still has a reputation as an unreliable submarine. Perhaps the worst offender when it comes to misconceptions of the submarine's capability is its stealth. People can still be found referring to the Collins as a noisy submarine. Although during its initial sea trials there were some issues with high-speed noise, which were rectified, when moving at a patrol quiet speed of 3 knots, Collins has been measured to emit less acoustic energy than the background ocean noise. With Collins, Australia now had a very potent anti-shipping capability with which to contest the sea-air gap. The vessel's stealth, lethality, and long-range endurance allow a number of these platforms to operate along the primary maritime approaches to the nation, increasing the tactical complexity posed to any enemy naval force. The combination of low-speed stealth and firepower makes the Collins particularly well suited to sea-air gap operations. if just one submarine can penetrate a task force's defences, with a broadside consisting of 6 Mark 48 ADCAP Seabass heavyweight torpedoes, it can potentially put the whole force on the bottom with one blow. Thus, by simply having the capability, the ADF forces a potential foe to deploy world-class ASW defences, complicating their operations substantially. The final capability which underpinned the Defence of Australia doctrine was the ability of the RAAF to mass its forces in the north of the nation. In line with the forward defence strategy, prior to the 1970s, the RAAF was completely optimised for out-of-area operations. Its squadrons were, by and large, based in the south of the country, and none were optimised for counter-maritime operations. The Australian-built Canberra bombers had some basic anti-shipping capability, but in a world of guided surface-to-air missiles, low-level bombing was rudimentary at best. The Mirage 3 fighters had no real anti-shipping capability to speak of. All of this changed with the next generation of tactical aircraft. Both the F-111C and the FA-18 Hornet were equipped with the Harpoon anti-ship cruise missile, giving them a truly potent counter-maritime capability. With a range of around 100 nautical miles, the sea-skimming Harpoon could be launched from the safety of the radar horizon, allowing RAAF strike packages to engage ships from a range and position where they were essentially immune from defensive missile fire. The only counter to these kinds of tactics is the use of radar pickets, but these can be simply prioritised for engagement. The F-111 was especially deadly in the maritime strike role. The combination of supersonic speed and low-altitude ingress made it very difficult to intercept, even for task forces with fighter cover, and each aircraft carried a payload of 4 missiles. Thus, a 12-strong squadron attack would be able to volley fire some 48 Harpoons, enough to pose a saturation threat to almost any task force. Nonetheless, this air power was not useful in the defence of the sea-air gap if it could not operate there. Numerous air bases had been constructed across Australia's north during World War II, but in the immediate post-war period, most of these had been abandoned. If the ADF was going to be able to effectively contest the sea-air gap, it had to be able to deploy the bulk of its air power in the north of the country, especially its 4 combat squadrons. This is easier said than done, however, as the north of Australia is, generally speaking, a relatively isolated and undeveloped area. Certainly a challenge if you want to sustain air operations. Permanently basing the hundreds of personnel required to run an airbase in areas as remote as the Kimberley is both expensive and not good for personnel retention. The answer to this problem is something called a bare base. Across Australia's north, 3 fully functional air bases were constructed, complete with ammunition and fuel bunkerage, command and control facilities, mess rooms, accommodation and hangars. Everything required to sustain multiple squadrons of tactical aircraft. These fully functional air bases are then only manned with a skeleton caretaker crew of perhaps 5 or 6 staff. When required, the base can be made operational in a matter of hours, with the fighter squadrons and all of their supporting staff airlifted in from their permanent bases. These bare bases are RAAF Sherger in far north Queensland, RAAF Curtin near the town of Derby in the Kimberley, and RAAF Learmouth on the far northwestern tip of Western Australia. Supplementing these bare bases are a pair of permanently manned base areas in the Northern Territory. The largest and most important is RAAF Tyndall, near the town of Katherine. The home of No. 75 Squadron, Tyndall provides a constant fighter presence in the north, in addition to substantial facilities that can support large-scale deployments. Finally, the RAAF maintains a base at the northern city of Darwin, which is home to several surveillance flights. By the mid-2000s, the lofty ambitions of the Defence of Australia doctrine had been realised. The ADF had constructed a series of formidable maritime defences that posed a nearly insurmountable threat to all but the most capable naval powers. Any hostile naval force entering the sea-air gap would be detected and tracked by Jawn, providing both early warning and targeting data to air, surface and submarine forces. The ability of the RAAF to mass its air power is a critical capability. Virtually any naval force that cannot provide itself with fighter and airborne early warning and control cover would be unable to stop the onslaught. Hiding behind the cover of the radar horizon, RAAF strike packages would be able to stand off and saturate the task force's missile defences with Harpoon volleys. Without a serious aircraft carrier capability, no naval force stood a realistic chance of mitigating these tactics, and because of Australia's geography, very long-range strike systems were required to effectively disrupt this defensive system. Yes, if hostile air bases could be taken in the Indonesian archipelago, this would degrade the performance of this defensive complex somewhat, but that would require a war to be fought in Southeast Asia first, giving Australia and her allies time to react. In essence, only the United States, Australia's treaty ally, had the capability to effectively penetrate this wider defensive system. By the end of the 2000s, it was clear to the Australian strategic community that this happy state of affairs was unlikely to persist indefinitely. Driven by an unprecedented episode of economic development, the People's Republic of China began a naval expansion of truly historic proportions. In the 15 years from 2005 to 2020, the PLAN's total battle force increased by 132 vessels, making it the largest navy in the world, many of them large major surface combatants. The new additions to the fleet include 2 55,000-ton aircraft carriers, 3 nuclear attack submarines, 5 conventional submarines, 11 destroyers, 5 frigates, and 51 corvettes. These numbers represent the total increase in the size of the force. They do not include the numerous older vessels that have been replaced by much more modern platforms. A total of 18 Type 52D class destroyers, as an example, are currently active. 25 units are planned. These vessels are, generally speaking, essentially equivalent to the Hobart class. Of even greater concern is the navy China is likely to have by 2030, which could include 65 major surface combatants, such as aircraft carriers, cruisers and destroyers, and 135 frigates and corvettes. This naval force poses a very substantial challenge to Australia's maritime defences. The combination of large and capable surface warships, such as the Type 55 class cruiser, and a real aircraft carrier capability will make Australia's northern basing infrastructure increasingly vulnerable. One of the main advantages Australia has is strategic depth. The nation is a very long way away from any potentially hostile major military power, but the Chinese major surface combatants, such as the Type 52D and Type 55 class cruisers and destroyers, are equipped with potent, long-range land attack cruise missiles. The CJ-10, essentially the Chinese equivalent of the Tomahawk, has a surface launch range well in excess of 1,000 kilometers, allowing naval task forces to strike Australian air bases and other facilities from a substantial distance, greatly increasing the range at which they pose a threat. Although these weapons probably lack the throw weight to do devastating damage alone, they could well disrupt the RAAF's operations for long enough to allow the carrier air groups to strike. The single most concerning increase in the PLAN's capability are its carriers. Even its current carrier capability poses a serious challenge to the RAAF's legacy maritime strike capability. Based on the Soviet Kuznetsov design, both the Liaoning and Shandong are stow-bar carriers that utilize a ski jump to facilitate short takeoffs. This means they cannot utilize fixed-wing airborne early warning and control aircraft like the E-2D Hawkeye. Nonetheless, they are equipped with helicopter-based airborne radar aircraft. Currently, the PLAN is introducing the Z-18J airborne early warning and control helicopter. Equipped with an X-band phased array radar that can be lowered below the ramp, the Z-18J provides airborne radar coverage with a claimed maximum range of 320 kilometers, although, as detection range is dependent upon target RCS, it is not clear what exactly is being detected at this range. Any airborne radar vastly increases the radar horizon. As an example, if a Z-18J was orbiting at a reasonably typical altitude of 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet, it would detect an incoming strike package that was operating at 30 meters at a range of 260 kilometers or 140 nautical miles, well outside the maximum launch envelope of an air-launched Harpoon. The Chinese deploy a capable fleet defense fighter, the J-15. Essentially a reverse-engineered Su-33, the J-15 is equipped with more modern missiles and fire control radar. Although there are conflicting reports as to the status of the J-15's AESA radar, which still appears to be developmental, it does deploy the active radar homing PL-12 medium-range air-to-air missile. Essentially the Chinese AMRAAM, the PL-12 boasts a head-on engagement range of around 100 kilometers. In essence, an incoming RAAF strike package operating at low altitude is likely to be detected and intercepted before it reaches Harpoon missile range. By the use of electronic warfare and complex attack vectors, maritime strike with the harpoon is still possible, but it is rendered much less viable in the face of carrier air power. This state of affairs will only get worse once the PLAN deploys its second-generation aircraft carrier, the Type 3. Currently under construction, the 100,000-ton Type 3 supercarrier will rival the US Nimitz class in terms of aggregate capability. Equipped with 3 electromagnetic catapults, the Type 3 will deploy a comparable amount of combat power to the RAAF's entire air combat group, some 4 strike fighter squadrons, both the 4th generation J-15 and the 5th generation J-31. The use of a Cato-bar design will not only increase the carrier's overall sortie generation rate and the performance of its air group, but it will allow the deployment of fixed-wing airborne early warning and control aircraft. The KJ-600 aircraft will both deploy a much more powerful AESA radar and be able to operate at an altitude of 30,000 feet, greatly increasing the radar coverage in comparison to the Z-18J. The first Type 3 class carrier should be operational by the end of this decade. It should be followed by a nuclear-powered variant called the Type 4, although currently development of this platform has been delayed due to budgetary and technical constraints. It is abundantly clear that 1 or 2 Chinese carrier strike group equivalents built around the Type 3 certainly possess the capability to overwhelm Australia's maritime defences, at least as they stood in the late 2000s. The firepower possessed by a supercarrier means the operation of one of these formations to the north of Australia, for even a week, could inflict such damage upon Australia's northern basing infrastructure that these key facilities may be unusable for months. In addition, the increasing use of standoff weapons and land attack cruise missiles greatly increases the range at which Chinese formations will pose a threat to Australian bases. But why should Australia be concerned about these developments? After all, Canberra has allies, and it's very unlikely that Beijing has plans to attack or invade Australia. To answer this fundamental question, we have to look at Australia's strategic environment, how a war might unfold between China and the United States, and what Canberra's role is likely to be in it. The greatest potential strategic threat Australia can face is the emergence of a major naval power in East Asia, one of the world's 3 great industrialized zones. The last time this happened, the nation faced a war of national survival. Canberra's Southeast Asian neighbours lack the military potential to ever pose a realistic strategic threat to Australia, given the nation's geographical advantages. Really, only a great naval power will possess the blue water capability to project sufficient force across the ocean to seriously threaten the mainland. Therefore, even with the friendliest of relations, Beijing's naval expansion should be of considerable concern to Canberra. Unfortunately, the strategic circumstance facing the nation is far more dire. Not only are Washington and Beijing now in a period of outright strategic competition and confrontation, but China under Xi has shown itself to be a revisionist power that stands in opposition to the regional order which has been the foundation of Australia's security and prosperity for the last 70 years. Peace, stability, and free and unfettered access to the ocean are the very pillars of the wealth, economic development, and human flourishing that the nation has enjoyed since World War II, and this is the very regional order Beijing aims to decisively challenge. The possibility of a war between the United States and China has never been higher, and given how beneficial the current security architecture has been to Australia, this is a contest in which Canberra has a direct stake. I would argue, in opposition to famous isolationists such as Hugh White and Paul Keating, that it is not in Australia's national interest to simply stand by and allow the future security architecture of the Indo-Pacific to be written for us. Neither is it in our interest to abandon our closest and most trusted friends, a relationship enshrined by treaty, while the fault lines of a new Cold War are emerging in places like Ukraine and Taiwan. The fundamental problem with the worldview of commentators and analysts like White and Keating is they treat the United States and China as 2 morally equivalent nations, a pair of great powers between which Australia simply sits. But this is simply not the case. Xi Jinping's China violates all of the values and principles upon which this nation was founded and led to its flourishing. The United States, for all of its flaws, extols those very same fundamental principles. Liberty, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and a rules-based international order, The Western powers may not always live up to these principles, but that does not mean they are not earnestly held. Given Communist China's treatment of its neighbours, its aggressive assertion of expansive maritime claims, its physical and economic coercion of Australia, including a campaign of domestic political interference, and the disturbing treatment of political dissidents and ethnic minorities, an Asian security order with China at its head is probably not a world Australia wishes to live in. So, if Australia was likely to participate in a Sino-American war, what would this conflict look like, and what would Canberra's role be in it? Predicting the future of conflict is always a very fraught endeavour. Warfare is an inherently dynamic phenomenon filled with friction, confusion, and uncertainty. Thus, trying to precisely forecast the course and outcome of a future conflict is probably a fool's errand. Nonetheless, there are some general trends that can be ascertained with reasonable confidence, wider themes that are driven by geography, economics, and aggregate force type and posture. We can be reasonably confident that in such a conflict China will be the aggressor, and that the opening phases of the war will be dominated by a large-scale offensive by the PLA. This is simply because the United States and its allies are all status quo powers. They are perfectly happy with the international order as it now stands. China, the revisionist power, is the one who wants to change that order, and, thus, will most likely be the one to initiate any conflict. Secondly, because of the balance of forces in the region, we can also be reasonably confident that the initial phase of the war, perhaps a period of 6 to 12 weeks, will be dominated by a large-scale Chinese offensive. As formidable as China is, it remains largely a regional power, meaning all of the PLA's forces and capabilities are already concentrated in East Asia. The United States, on the other hand, has a global force posture, with the bulk of its air and naval assets outside of the region. Obviously, the aggregate military capability of the United States is truly formidable and is more than likely superior to China, and will remain so for the foreseeable future, but that capability is dispersed. It will take weeks, potentially months, for Washington to bring its weight to bear, especially its naval forces. It may also take time for the major European powers, who now look more and more as though they would actively participate in such a conflict, to redeploy their forces into the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, the PLA will have a window of opportunity to achieve their strategic aims before the West can bring their superior power to bear, after which Beijing can simply sit behind the PLA's anti-access area denial complex and present a fait accompli. The most obvious Chinese objective is Taiwan. However, in such a war, we may or may not actually see a large-scale invasion of the island. Taiwan is a country of 23 million people and contains sprawling urban areas. It still possesses one of the largest militaries in the region, with an active reserve force in excess of 2 million. Gaining a full understanding of the ROC Army's actual order of battle is difficult, although it appears to have a mobilized strength of 3 field armies. Launching an invasion from the mainland is a truly daunting prospect. It would certainly be the largest amphibious operation undertaken since Overlord. Once ashore, the PLA would be facing a nightmare of high-intensity urban battle, which would likely consume entire brigades on a daily basis. This is hardly an appetizing prospect, and nor is it a path to rapid victory. Nonetheless, Taiwan's maritime geography poses vulnerabilities in addition to defensive benefits. Food and energy security are critical weaknesses. Taiwan only produces around 35% of the food required to meet its needs. Thus, the PLA will likely be highly incentivized to isolate Taiwan by launching amphibious operations to its north and south. Establishing air and missile forces in the Yaeyama Islands, for example, would essentially sever Taipei's sea lines of communication to the United States. This would mean violating the sovereignty of Japan, but in any conflict with the United States, it's virtually certain that Japan would already be an active participant. For example, US basing on Okinawa would be a prime target for the PLA's missile forces on day 1 of the conflict. In any case, considering the risk already taken in initiating a larger general regional conflict, Beijing will most likely aim to achieve its wider strategic objectives beyond Taiwan. Dominating the whole First Island chain through to the South China Sea is a long-standing strategic goal. Thus, we are very likely to see a large-scale amphibious offensive all across the region with the aim of establishing island bases and ejecting the US presence from the first island chain. With US bases either taken or destroyed, and PLA missile forces established along this defensive barrier, the Allies will have to contend with a very formidable defensive complex. With these objectives accomplished, Beijing will hope to negotiate from a position of strength. American plans for the war are much easier to ascertain, as much of the wider strategic community is less opaque in the United States. Perhaps one of the most influential early publications outlining American strategy for a potential conflict with China is Jan van Tol's Air-Sea Battle. Written in 2010 and published by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, Air-Sea Battle outlines a wider campaign plan for a maritime conflict with the People's Republic centered on Taiwan. Although it is not technically authoritative, Air-Sea Battle outlines a very plausible American strategy for the conflict. Van Tol began with two very fair assumptions, that given the regional balance of forces, China would have the initial advantage, and that the only allies Washington could reliably expect to be active participants were Japan and Australia. Other nations may end up becoming involved, but given the immense strategic risk the minor regional powers would face in any conflict with China, the United States cannot count on their participation. In simple terms, Air-Sea Battle revolved around two strategic objectives. The first was keeping maritime lines of communication with Taiwan open. This is more difficult than it seems, as the PLA's wider anti-access area denial complex is specifically designed to target USN battle forces in the Western Pacific. In essence, this operational concept hoped to parry the initial thrust by trying to limit its effectiveness. Van Tol's four initial objectives were: withstanding the initial attack and limiting damage to US and Allied forces and bases, executing a blinding campaign against PLA battle networks, executing a suppression campaign against PLA long-range ISR and strike systems, and finally, seizing and sustaining the initiative in the air, sea, space, and cyber domains. The main objective of this first phase of the campaign was to limit the damage inflicted by what would certainly be a very powerful opening blow. Specifically, to try and disrupt PLA battle networks, the core of the A2AD complex, in order to allow USN battle forces to operate within the PLA's weapon engagement envelope. The simple strategic arithmetic is, if the US can utilize its carrier forces in the Western Pacific, then Taiwan can be kept in the war. The second major phase of the conflict, the Allied counteroffensive, aimed to cripple China economically. Van Tol's idea was not necessarily to assault the first island chain head-on, but to exploit the Allies' long-term advantages. China is imprisoned by its geography. The main reason Chinese strategic planners have been so focused upon the US presence along the first island chain, an arbitrary line that runs from Japan through the Philippines and Indonesia, is that China can be isolated from the world by that military presence. The seas are the highways of global commerce. Over 70% of global trade transits the world's oceans. This is particularly acute for China. Over 95% of China's energy imports move by sea, and over 80% of those imports traverse the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. Without those liquid fuels, the Chinese economy will come to a screeching halt. Beijing is trying to diversify its energy imports, with increasing investment in overland supply, but this simply isn't enough to offset the sheer growth in Chinese demand. For example, despite doubling the size of the pipeline capacity from Siberia, Russia only provided 15% of China's crude oil needs in 2020. Nearly everything else comes by sea from ports in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. In another example, Chinese steel production is almost exclusively dependent upon Australian iron ore imports, which currently are more than double the rest of China's suppliers combined. Essentially, as China has become more and more integrated with the global economy, it has become more dependent upon global trade, not just for exports of consumer goods, but the raw materials upon which the Chinese economy runs. All of that trade moves by sea. In order to exploit this economic vulnerability, the Allies can leverage China's geographical weaknesses. By dominating maritime choke points along the first island chain, China can very effectively be isolated from the global sea lines of communication. Critically, these choke points are quite a long way from mainland China, making their protection difficult. This strategy is called the Far Blockade by Van Tol, meaning imposing an economic blockade on China at a great distance from their ports. Australia would play a critical role in implementing this strategy. The vast majority of Chinese trade moves through the Malacca Straits and the Indonesian archipelago, and Australia's northern bases are perfectly placed to support blockade operations. For example, the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits could all be effectively closed to large-scale shipping simply by air power deployed from northern Australia. Just the threat of B-1B Lancers operating from RAAF Tyndall would certainly be enough to prevent commercial shipping from moving through this area. Australia also provides several other potential benefits to Allied forces in this scenario. Because of the interoperability of US and ADF forces, USAF assets could slot directly into the ADF's command structure. Australia already has reasonably large airbasing infrastructure and a world-class integrated air defence system called Vigilair. The ADF's command and control infrastructure, through Vigilair and its joint operational headquarters, is more than capable of directing theatre-wide air and naval operations in real time, and HQ JOC is already integrated with US Pacific Command. Thus, Southern Allied operations could certainly be commanded by the ADF, of course under US Global Command, allowing Pacific Command to focus on other areas of the campaign. Therefore, Australia could be a highly valuable ally, providing not only very capable forces in their own right, but acting as a nucleus for operations in Oceania and Southeast Asia, allowing the United States to leverage the ADF's investment in force multipliers and command and control, and its excellent officer corps, all in a strategically vital area of the Indo-Pacific, where such a war could be won or lost. But herein lies the problem. Considering the geographic challenge confronting China along the Indonesian archipelago, and the ability of the Allies to use Australia as the nucleus of the Far Blockade campaign, the PLA will be highly incentivized to neutralize the threat the ADF poses in the early offensive phase of the war. Along with US basing in Okinawa and Guam, we should absolutely expect Australia's northern air bases to be a first-order target. The PLA will also wish to contest these maritime choke points with air power, and although technically the PLAAF can use tanker assets to deploy its fighters this far south, doing so will place a serious burden on an already critical supporting asset. Tankers are very valuable aircraft, and the PLA will need them everywhere. Thus, we should also expect amphibious operations in the Indonesian archipelago, with the aim of establishing forward air bases from which PLAAF fighter and missile forces can defend Chinese maritime communications by contesting Allied control of these maritime choke points. Obviously, the establishment of forward operating bases within 1,000 nautical miles from Australia would pose a very substantial threat, bringing the ADF's northern basing infrastructure within range of the PLA's prolific medium-range ballistic missile arsenal. In such a scenario, because of their weakness in air and naval forces, the Indonesian military stands little chance of preventing these kinds of amphibious operations alone. Therefore, there is a serious possibility that the ADF will have to face the prospect of operations by 1 or 2 carrier strike group equivalents, in addition to a comparable number of amphibious strike group equivalents, in our primary area of operations. Worse, considering the PLA will probably be the one to initiate any conflict and likely have the advantage of surprise, we may well have to face this threat before extensive Allied assets can be deployed to the Australian theatre. Perhaps Allied intelligence may be lucky enough to be provided with sufficient visibility to predict Beijing's actions, meaning Allied assets can be deployed to the theatre in time. But such a luxury is not something we can bet Australia's security on. As discussed previously, Collins aside, Australia's current maritime defences are not really equipped to strike maritime formations with large and capable carrier air groups and airborne radar aircraft. The RAAF is also going through a period of relative weakness when it comes to maritime strike. Currently, the majority of the RAAF's fighter squadrons lack a potent maritime strike weapon. In its Block 3F configuration, the F-35A lacks any real maritime strike capability beyond simple laser-guided bombs. This state of affairs was intended. The F-35 was designed to add capabilities through a spiral development program, allowing the aircraft to be procured faster. In its much more lethal Block 4 iteration, the F-35A will have a much larger suite of capabilities, including the integration of the small diameter bomb 2, called the Stormbreaker, which does have some anti-ship capability. but the SDB's relatively limited range and small payload make it unsuited to a high-end naval battle. Numerous F-35A operators are currently working on the integration of a capable anti-ship cruise missile as part of the Block 4 upgrade program, which will either be the Norwegian Joint Strike Missile or Lockheed Martin's LRASM, but we are unlikely to see a weapon fielded by the RAAF until the mid-2020s. At the time of publication, the RAAF only has a single squadron of tactical fighters which are equipped to conduct high-end maritime strike, No. 1 Squadron, which still fields the Harpoon. So what, precisely, can the ADF do to mitigate such a threat? Australia is a middle power, and certainly a very significant military actor in the region, but the nation will never have the military potential to go toe-to-toe with an emergent superpower. Even if Canberra decided it was going to procure its own carrier capability to meet this threat head-on, the only realistic possibilities would be a vessel that was similar to the Canberra class in terms of size and displacement. Certainly no match for a 100,000-ton supercarrier if you intend to fight a blue water naval battle. In any case, assuming the money was made available, procuring any such capability would probably take a decade to build, equip, and deploy, including standing up the strike fighter squadrons. But the threat may well manifest sooner than that. Admiral William Lesher, United States Navy Deputy Chief of Operations, recently testified to the House Armed Services Committee that it is the opinion of the USN that the 2020s, not the 2030s, represent the decade of peak risk when it comes to a conflict with China. This evaluation raises very serious concerns regarding the Australian government's recent procurement decisions. The Hunter-class frigate, the AUKUS submarine, the Sci-Fire hypersonic weapon, the air power teaming system or Loyal Wingman, these are all very impressive programs that will, by 2040, turn Australia into a much more capable military actor. But, with the exception of the Loyal Wingman, barely any of the announced procurement decisions over the last 5 years will lead to a significant improvement in the ADF's ability to wage a high-intensity defensive naval campaign in the 2020s. We should certainly not expect to see an Australian hypersonic anti-ship missile until the 2030s. Therefore, Australia needs a new set of capabilities, nested within a new operational concept, that is within the nation's means, can be realised within the decade, and is capable of offsetting China's naval superiority, specifically by preventing the operation of its carrier and amphibious forces in Australia's northern approaches. Ironically enough, the Chinese themselves may have provided the answer to this nearly insurmountable problem: anti-access area denial, or A2AD. In terms of the naval balance of forces, Beijing and Canberra face a very similar set of operational challenges. Both face a potential foe with overwhelming superiority in blue water naval assets, specifically supercarriers. It is just as imperative that China prevent the United States from operating its carrier strike groups in its approaches as it is for the ADF to prevent the PLAs, and in Beijing's solution to this problem, they may have laid out a blueprint for Australia. China's A2AD complex is designed to prevent the United States from operating its battle forces in the Western Pacific, denying a very large area of ocean to the USN. It is composed of 3 general capabilities. The first is a wide area ocean surveillance system. This system is a complex of different sensors which, when used in combination, can provide ship detection, track, and classification over a massive area of maritime geography. These include electronic intelligence, synthetic aperture radar and optical imaging satellites, over-the-horizon backscatter radar systems, and high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aerial vehicles. Different surveillance systems have different strengths and weaknesses, which is why so many different kinds have to be used in combination. For example, although a satellite can cover a very wide area, it only sees the Earth in a thin strip called a swath that is practically infinite in one dimension but may be as narrow as 200 kilometers in the other. In low Earth orbit, a satellite moves at about 8 kilometers per second, some 27,000 kilometers per hour, meaning that they cannot provide sustained surveillance. A satellite may detect a naval formation, but within a matter of minutes, that part of the Earth's surface will no longer be visible. This is a critical issue when it comes to tracking ships because they move, often at up to 30 knots and in an unknown direction. This generates an ever-increasing potential area where the ship could be, which is called the area of uncertainty. Moving at 30 knots, within just 1 hour, the area of uncertainty will be 2,827 square nautical miles, nearly 10,000 square kilometers. This area is far greater than the target acquisition footprint of low-altitude anti-ship missiles. As effective as satellites are in the role of wide-area surveillance, unless you have very, very fast weapons, they have to be supplemented by other systems such as a UAV that can provide persistent contact data, something called a track. The primary Chinese satellite capability is the Yaogan constellation. Arranged in a staggered series of polar orbits, the Yaogan constellation contains a large number of satellites, some of which have been in orbit since 2006, and contains approximately 18 electro-optical imaging satellites, 8 synthetic aperture radar systems, and 16 electronic intelligence groups. The ELINT satellites are launched in formations of 3, which allow them to triangulate any detected emissions. Using these systems in combination again allows for the complex as a whole to offset the limitations of each kind of technology. Imaging satellites are impacted by weather, while radar satellites are not. However, they can far more effectively classify targets, and the ELINT groups have a much wider swath. These satellites are arrayed to cover the Western Pacific roughly every hour. The Yaogan constellation is supplemented by a series of unmanned aerial vehicles, such as the propeller-driven BZK-005 Giant Eagle and the much more capable WZ-7 Solar Dragon that is similar in role to the RQ-4 Global Hawk. These unmanned airborne systems are supplemented by a number of maritime patrol aircraft, including the Shaanxi Y-8. Finally, the Chinese have been working on a number of over-the-horizon radar backscatter systems, which have only just reached initial operational capability. All of these wide-area surveillance systems are designed to generate a pervasive sensor footprint across the Western Pacific, which is then directed to a dedicated data fusion center and PLA theater command. Once a surface task force is detected, tracked and classified, it can then be engaged. The real meat of the PLA's A2AT complex are its long-range strike systems. Increasing the range of your weapon systems is, in addition to wide-area surveillance, the core of the A2AT operational concept. Long-range weapons achieve 2 very important things. Firstly, they can be launched by surface, subsurface and airborne platforms from a range that is well outside of the task force's defences, including a carrier strike group's combat air patrol. Secondly, by increasing the range of your weapons, you massively increase the region of ocean where you can effectively engage the enemy. Denying the enemy freedom of maneuver over a vast area substantially constrains their operational prospects. Currently, the PLA fields a number of long-range maritime strike weapons, which can be launched from air, land, warship, and submarine. Perhaps the most famous, or infamous, is the anti-ship ballistic missile, the DF-21D. As is typical when a new form of military technology is introduced, the ASBM has almost certainly been overhyped in the non-specialist media. Given the numerous ballistic missile defense capabilities currently fielded by the United States Navy, both mid-course interceptors such as SM-3 and terminal phase defensive missiles like the SM-6, it is arguable that, in terms of terminal lethality, the anti-ship ballistic missile poses less of a threat than sea-skimming, supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. What ASBMs like the DF-21D and DF-26 do provide is area of uncertainty mitigation. They travel so fast that using satellite targeting data alone becomes feasible for long-range engagement. The bulk of the PLA anti-ship missile capability is still its anti-ship cruise missiles. These include the supersonic YJ-18 and YJ-12 and subsonic YJ-83. Fielded on strategic bombers, tactical fighters, destroyers and frigates, submarines and land-based missile batteries, the PLA can generate such a volume of anti-ship cruise missile fire that even the defences of a mighty Ford-class carrier strike group could stand a very good chance of being saturated, meaning the defensive missile fire can simply not shoot down enough missiles in time. Furthermore, even if the carrier's defences hold up, this kind of incoming fire will soon deplete its defensive missile stocks, forcing the formation to return to base and rearm, achieving a mission kill. The PLA's A2AT complex has become a formidable defensive tool. It has required the expenditure of a disproportionate amount of effort to counter. By relying on wide area surveillance and long-range maritime strike systems, the PLA may have denied the entire Western Pacific to the United States Navy's carrier forces, all without fielding a single supercarrier themselves. This kind of a system seems to fit Australia's needs perfectly. Because it relies on missiles and sensors, rather than platforms, it is both cost-effective and can be implemented in a matter of years, not decades. In fact, the ADF already has many of the elements of an effective A2AD system in place. Perhaps the best way to think of the A2AD complex is as a kill chain. You have different sensors that can detect, track, and classify vessels over a large area, a command and control complex that processes that information and directs the strike forces, and then the long-range maritime strike systems themselves. The ADF's wide area surveillance systems are already well suited to the A2AD operational concept. Dawn has already been discussed. One is on very solid ground, claiming that Dawn is the most advanced radar network of any kind anywhere in the world. It is almost certainly more advanced than the Chinese equivalents, given the system's maturity. The ADF is also introducing a world-class, high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aerial vehicle, the MQ-4C Triton. A navalized version of the RQ-4 Global Hawk, the Triton can fly at over 50,000 feet for 30 hours. Cruising at a speed of 330 knots, a Triton can cover Australia's entire exclusive economic zone, circumnavigating the continent in a single flight. But more impressive than its flight characteristics are Triton's sensors. The primary ISR system is the AN-ZPY multifunction active sensor. Essentially a powerful AESA radar with a 360-degree field of view, the system can take synthetic radar images of the surface, through clouds, across a large swath. Combined with its impressive range and operating altitude, Triton can provide radar imagery of over 8 million square kilometers in a single mission. The ZPY-3 is supplemented by the Raytheon MTS-B multispectral electro-optical infrared sensor, the same system as used in the MQ-9 Reaper, allowing for close visual inspection of detected targets. The most critical capability when using the Triton in an A2AD operational concept is its electronic intelligence suite. Basically the same system is utilized in the EP-3 electronic surveillance aircraft, the Triton's ESM systems can be used to passively detect, classify, and geolocate hostile electronic emissions, including radar signals, at a range that is well beyond their detection radius. This is very important for the non-stealthy Triton. The missing link in the ADF's surveillance capability are space-based sensors. Satellite intelligence is a key link in supplementing the ADF's current sensors. As capable as Dawn is, it has limitations, and one of the most important are its scan rates. In order for the radar to achieve good visibility on an area, it needs to interrogate it for a period of time. These places are called dwell interrogation regions. Basically, compared to a normal radar, Dawn is a little more like a spotlight rather than a light bulb. Although by moving from one dwell interrogation region to another, Dawn can cover a very large area, this is very slow compared to space-based systems. Dawn is much more efficient if it can be told where to look. There are also issues with resolution and classification. Although advanced signal processing has alleviated this problem, just in general terms, because the radar beam can take multiple paths through the ionosphere, over-the-horizon radars often have problems resolving the number of targets they are looking at. A satellite image can be used to calibrate the system, greatly increasing its resolution in addition to providing classification data. Having a track is worthless if you are not sure what you are looking at. It is evident from statements in several white papers that the Australian government does have significant access to Allied satellite intelligence, which does provide a significant capability. However, US systems are not optimized to operate with the ADF's other sensors, and Australia will always have to compete with the system's owners for priority targeting. Thus, there is a real opportunity for the ADF to invest in its own, sovereign, satellite intelligence capability. One of the major disadvantages of relying on American systems is their orbits. Generally speaking, when you want to cover the whole Earth with satellite coverage, you use a polar orbit, meaning the satellite orbits in a north-south inclination. In this configuration, as the satellite orbits, the Earth spins beneath it. Again, just in general terms, although a polar orbit will provide global coverage, it will only give you visibility on a specific area twice every 24 hours, once during the day and once at night. What this means is, if you want to have something approaching constant satellite coverage, you need lots and lots of satellites, which is why the Yaogan constellation is so large. but an Australian satellite does not have to utilise a polar orbit. Because the area of interest here, essentially Jaun's footprint, is on the equator, an Australian satellite can use an equatorial orbit. This provides many significant benefits. Unlike a polar orbit, a satellite utilising an equatorial orbit follows an orbital path that is slightly offset from the equator. Although such a satellite will never cover the northern or southern latitudes, it would provide nearly constant coverage of the equator. An imaging satellite in a low equatorial orbit with an altitude of 1,680 kilometers, offset by 10 degrees, would provide 10 passes per day, 4 during daytime. At 10 degrees, that satellite would cover the area between the Torres Strait and the South China Sea, including the Philippine island of Mindanao. Therefore, just 2 satellites, one synthetic aperture radar and one electro-optical and infrared imaging, would provide the ADF with 20 satellite passes per day, nearly 1 per hour. With a sovereign satellite capability, the ADF's sensor footprint would be practically as pervasive as the PLA's in the Western Pacific. The satellites in equatorial orbit would provide nearly hourly passes over Australia's northern approaches, giving the ADF constant wide area surveillance. As the task force enters the southern South China Sea, it is detected by the radar satellite and then resolved and classified by the imaging system. This detection will immediately draw Jaun's attention, with one or more of the transmitters constantly painting the area with high-frequency radiation. Depending on its resolution, Jaun's information alone may very well constitute a firing solution on the formation. Within hours, a Triton will be in position to stalk the task force, lingering at the very edge of its sensor footprint beyond its detection radius, passively gathering signals intelligence, including the location of hostile radars. The combination of these different sensors provides all of the elements required to strike the formation. It has been detected by the radar satellite, tracked by Jaun and classified by Triton and the imaging satellite, and with Jaun and Triton providing real-time location and course, the ADF will have a firing solution. The next element in the A2AD kill chain is command and control infrastructure, and here the ADF already has the required elements in place. The RAAF operates a world-class integrated air defense system called Vigil Air, a system that combines inputs from numerous ADF assets and generates a real-time, theatre-wide picture of the battle space, which is then coordinated at 2 regional operational centres at RAAF Tyndall and RAAF Williamtown in New South Wales. Each of these operational centres are capable of commanding a theatre-wide aerial battle, but for joint force employment, Vigil Air is integrated with Headquarters Joint Operations Command, which commands all ADF forces. Missile forces can be controlled directly by the ADS satellite communications, which is a critical supporting capability when making very long-range cruise missile shots that have to be updated mid-course. Australia purchased a stake in the American wideband global satellite communications network by paying for one of the WGS satellites. A dedicated sovereign satellite communication system is being developed under Project JP9102, attracting bids from Lockheed Martin Australia, Boeing Australia, Airbus and Northrop Grumman. This should provide the ADF with dedicated, global, high-bandwidth satellite communications without the need to share the asset with other users. This will greatly enhance the ADF's global command and control capability. The command and control infrastructure that is currently possessed by the ADF is more than capable of conducting the kind of air and naval battle being envisaged here, and thus there really are no additional elements required to facilitate the A2AD operational concept. This brings us to an area of substantial weakness: long-range maritime strike systems. The whole point of the PLA's A2AD complex is the ability to generate a massive volume of anti-shipping fires over a very large area. As discussed previously, the primary anti-ship cruise missile in the ADF's arsenal is the venerable Harpoon, which is lacking in both standoff range and lethality, and the F-35A is currently unequipped with a credible maritime strike weapon. In essence, there are 3 weapon systems that can realistically meet the ADF's requirements within the context of this operational concept. The first is the long-range anti-ship missile. Essentially a maritime strike version of the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, the LRASM is one of the most lethal anti-shipping systems currently available. The weapon keeps the JASSM's stealthy body, warhead and power plant, but simply adds a new seeker system allowing for counter-maritime operations. As opposed to supersonic Russian and Chinese weapons, which rely on speed to reduce the effectiveness of shipboard defensive systems, the subsonic LRASM uses stealth. The missile's airframe already has a low radar cross-section, and the weapon relies exclusively upon passive sensors. Rather than a radar, the LRASM uses a combination of passive electronic surveillance and an imaging infrared seeker to find its prey. At long range, the weapon generates an electromagnetic picture of the battlespace, plotting both friendly and hostile electronic transmissions such as radars, radios, and data links. The weapon uses AI-enhanced targeting software to select its own attack profile, which is critical if data links have been disrupted, allowing it to work effectively in heavy electronic warfare environments. The weapon is smart enough to identify vessels acting as radar pickets and evade them, focusing on high-value assets such as capital ships. It then drops to wave-top level and relies on its imaging seeker for terminal guidance. The combination of the missile's stealthy airframe, passive sensors, and low-altitude prosecution mean the LRASM will be detected late, substantially reducing the amount of time a ship's defenses have to react. This is the same reason why Russian and Chinese weapons utilize a supersonic terminal attack profile. Over and above the enhanced lethality of the LRASM, the greatest advantage the weapon provides is range. The JASSM-ER has a maximum range of approximately 500 nautical miles, or 926 kilometers, but because of the new seeker, the LRASM's maximum engagement envelope is somewhat smaller. As is typical, official statistics understate its performance, simply claiming greater than 200 nautical miles. Perhaps a more realistic estimate is 400 nautical miles, meaning a 20% reduction from the JASSM-ER, although some sources have claimed 300. We must also remember that this may be different for air and surface launch weapons, depending on the rocket booster. The development of longer-ranged variants is highly probable. The LRASM retains the JASSM's 1,000-pound broach warhead. A reduction to a perfectly adequate 500 pounds would provide a significant amount of additional fuel volume. With this kind of range, RAAF F-35A strike packages would be able to strike naval formations 1,000 nautical miles from Australia's bases, all without relying upon valuable tanker assets. Furthermore, with such a long range, the strike aircraft will be able to stand off so far that they will be well outside the range of any defensive system, including the carrier's air group. The LRASM has already been acquired for the RAAF. Reportedly, a contract for 200 weapons has been signed, and these will be integrated with the FA-18F Super Hornet fleet. A surface launch variant is jointly being developed by US and Australian defence industry, which will include the Mark 41 VLS and canister-launched variants. In fact, although precise details are scarce, Lockheed Martin claims that the canister-launched variant will take up the same space, weight, and power as the Mark 141 Harpoon canister-launched system. Therefore, the weapon could be fielded on the Royal Australian Navy's warships. Although the LRASM has been selected for use with the RAAF Super Hornet fleet, there is still another option for the F-35A, the Norwegian Joint Strike Missile, or JSM. An air-launched development of the currently operational Naval Strike Missile, the JSM possesses much of the LRASM's lethality. The weapon also relies upon passive sensors, both a passive electronic intelligence system for long-range guidance and a terminal imaging infrared seeker. The JSM's combination of passive sensors, a small and stealthy airframe, and the very low infrared signature of its micro-turbo TRI-40 turbojet engine make it a very hard weapon to stop. Much like the LRASM, the JSM will be detected late, compressing the defender's available reaction time. The major difference between the LRASM and JSM is size. The JSM is a much smaller weapon. Its total mass is a very slim 410 kilograms, less than 1,000 pounds. This has some advantages. Unlike the LRASM, the weapon is small enough to fit inside the F-35A's weapon bay. This would allow the fighter to approach closer to the target formation undetected, preserving the F-35's stealth, although this is more than offset by the LRASM's ability to stand off. Additionally, as the JSM is roughly half the weight, twice as many weapons can be carried on a mission, 4 instead of 2, greatly increasing the weight of fire any particular air raid can generate. This smaller weight also has significant downsides. Unlike the LRASM's 1,000-pound broach warhead, the JSM only delivers 125 kilograms, or just over 250 pounds, of high explosive. A 250-pound warhead might be perfectly adequate for engaging targets such as a frigate or destroyer, where even an explosion that small in the internals of the vessel may well cause devastating damage. The same cannot be said for a capital ship. In fact, unless an impact hit a vital area or caused a secondary fire or explosion, a 100,000-ton supercarrier may be able to shrug off a single JSM hit. A 1,000-pound broach warhead is designed to penetrate and destroy hardened structures on land, allowing the weapon to reach the very bowels of the ship, such as engines and bunkers. The LRASM's additional penetration and 4 times the high explosive would cause a great deal more damage. This is all the more important when one considers the formidable defensive systems protecting the carrier. If one can only hope to get a limited number of hits on a high-value asset like a Type 3, it is all the more important that those hits do crippling damage. This is somewhat offset by the greater number of JSMs that can be launched by a strike package, increasing the chance of saturation, but even so, the difference in lethality is significant. Even if the LRASM's warhead was reduced to 500 pounds, it would still be twice the size. Another major issue with the JSM's small size is its lower range. Utilizing a high-high-low attack profile, meaning high-altitude launch, high-altitude cruise, and low-altitude prosecution, the JSM can reportedly produce an impressive 300 nautical mile launch radius. This is absolutely a tactically significant range, especially when one remembers that the F-35A can carry the weapon internally, but it is still probably inferior to the LRASM. Current estimates of the LRASM's total engagement envelope range from 300 to 400 nautical miles using the same high-high-low profile. However, it probably has a much greater potential for growth in this area. As already mentioned, the LRASM's warhead could be miniaturized, greatly increasing its range potential. But of more significance is Lockheed Martin's development of longer-ranged JASSM variants. The latest version of the family, the AGM-158D, or JASSM Extreme Range, is currently being manufactured and should reach IOC with the US military in 2024. Externally, the XR is almost identical to the ER variant upon which the LRASM is based, yet extends the range to 1,000 nautical miles. As the LRASM is just a JASSM variant, we should absolutely expect these technological developments to migrate over to future versions of the anti-shipping sibling. A 750 nautical mile ranged LRASM ER is certainly conceivable in the next 5 years. The JSM's range potential is simply limited by its small size. This is especially important when you keep the A2AD operational concept in mind. A weapon's range is not just about the launch platform's ability to stand off, it increases your aggregate weapon employment zone and thus the total area you deny to the enemy. Despite the fact that the Australian government has funded the JSM's development, there are other reasons to suspect the RAAF will select the LRASM for the F-35 fleet. Over and above the improved range, potential and lethality, the LRASM is already being integrated with the Super Hornet, and Australian industry is jointly developing the surface-launched variant with Lockheed Martin. Although it seems to be the logical choice, we simply won't know until a decision is made. Certainly, if selected, the JSM would serve the RAAF well. There is another long-range maritime strike system that the ADF should consider, the Block 5 Tomahawk. Now some 40 years old, the venerable Tomahawk is perhaps most famous as a land attack cruise missile. Although the basic airframe is old, the weapon has been steadily upgraded over the decades, maintaining its relevance and lethality. Whilst the Tomahawk is subsonic and unstealthy, it still provides an extremely long range given its size. The new Block 5 reportedly has a surface launch range in excess of 1,000 nautical miles. The Block 5 program contains 3 versions of Tomahawk, the Block 5, 5A, and 5B. The Block 5 and 5B are improved versions of the tactical Tomahawk, which will be integrated into the RAN's Hobart-class destroyers. The variant of interest is the Block 5A, which is a dedicated anti-ship cruise missile variant with a new seeker. Details of this variant are a little scarce, however Raytheon claims the new weapon is specifically designed to penetrate advanced air defences. This seems to be a difficult task for the unstealthy, subsonic Tomahawk, especially considering the capability of layered naval air defences. In order to improve the Tomahawk's ability to operate in more hostile environments, Raytheon has hardened the electronics, making the weapon much less susceptible to jamming. The Block 5 can operate effectively without external communications or a GPS signal. Importantly, considering its relatively large RCS, at least in comparison to the LRASM, the weapon deploys its own offensive electronic countermeasure package, which presumably includes a DFRM deception jammer. If the weapon uses a passive seeker in the vein of the JSM and LRASM and contains an advanced DFRM jamming system, it could be far more difficult to detect and engage than its 40-year-old dad bod would lead us to believe. In addition to the Mark 41 VLS surface ships, the Tomahawk can be launched from land-based batteries. Both the US Army and Marine Corps are developing land-based launch systems for the Tomahawk. Therefore, the Block 5 Tomahawk could provide many substantial benefits to the ADF. Firstly, it would give the RAN's major surface combatants a 1,000 nautical mile maritime strike range. Indeed, this could include the Collins-class submarines. But perhaps of more significance is the ability to deploy the weapon from mobile shore batteries. Even from mainland Australia, Block 5 Tomahawks would be able to strike naval forces as far away as the Celebes Sea, which sits between Indonesia and the Philippines. In summation, Australia could achieve a formidable A2AZ complex with a relatively minor investment in just a few critical capabilities. So many of the required systems are already in place, thanks to the investment made during the Defence of Australia period, and only a few enabling technologies are required. Given Australia's geographic advantages, just 2 or 3 satellites arranged in the appropriate orbits could provide a comparable surveillance footprint to the whole Yaogan constellation, all at a fraction of the cost. Just as an example, the commercial Worldview 4 satellite, which was put into orbit in 2016 and had a 1-meter telescope with a resolution of 31 centimeters, cost a little over $800 million. Triton has already been acquired. However, the proposed fleet is, like the ADF as a whole, reasonably small. Just 7 will be acquired, which could very feasibly be increased to 12. Nonetheless, the Tritons will be supported by 12 MQ-9B Sky Guardian medium-altitude unmanned air systems. A maritime-capable variant of the MQ-9 Reaper, the Sky Guardian will be equipped with an AESA radar system, allowing them to conduct volume search. Much like the Reaper, the Sky Guardian will be able to employ weapons such as the JDAM. With these medium-altitude systems available, the Triton fleet will be able to focus on the high-end threat. In addition to these new surveillance systems, if the LRASM and Tomahawk were procured in large numbers and integrated across the ADF's force structure, Australia would possess a truly formidable defensive capability. Enemy task forces, including supercarrier strike group equivalents, would be rapidly detected, tracked, and classified by satellite while they were still in the South China and Philippine seas. Working in combination, Jawn and Triton would provide persistent and high-fidelity track data, ensuring the maintenance of a firing solution. Enabled by these new long-range strike systems, the ADF would be able to engage enemy task forces at over 1,000 nautical miles, or 1,800 kilometers from its bare bases. Just to put that into perspective, that's about as far as Melbourne is from Rockhampton. As they enter the ADF's massive weapon employment zone, the Carrier Strike Group faces the prospect of a massed, coordinated anti-ship cruise missile strike, all directed by the ADF's centralized command and control complex. If the RAAF massed its air power and deployed a multi-squadron attack, it alone could generate a colossal weight of fire, upwards of 60 incoming LRASMs, all of which would be launched from well outside of the carrier's defenses. The weapons themselves can all be controlled from ADF Operational Command. Utilizing the ADF's high-bandwidth global satellite communications network, mid-course updates can be transmitted directly to the weapon, accounting for any defensive maneuver. For a Type 52D class destroyer, an LRASM would come over the radar horizon at a range of 12 nautical miles. At a terminal attack speed of 600 knots, the weapon will impact in 83 seconds. But we must account for the LRASM's stealth. It probably won't be detected until much closer, perhaps half of that distance, maybe less. If we add to this the surface, subsurface, and land-launched Tomahawks, the number of incoming missiles could exceed 100, all of which could be timed to strike simultaneously. Given the stealth and lethality of these systems, and the ADF's electronic warfare capability, That kind of weight of fire would more than likely saturate a strike group's defenses. At the very least, it would empty their magazines, especially considering the RAAF could generate 2 or 3 such air raids every 24 hours. This capability can also be used to defend Indonesia. Because they have to remain stationary, any large-scale amphibious operations would be particularly vulnerable to these kinds of standoff strikes. Clearly, such a defensive complex would pose a very difficult challenge to the PLAN. It would take a disproportionate level of capability to effectively counter, and could be achievable within a 5 to 7 year time horizon and at a realistic cost. After all, we are not talking about changing the ADF's force structure in any fundamental way. Obviously, if the PLA was able to focus its entire capability against Australia for a protracted period, including its anti-satellite systems and all of its naval and long-range strike capability, the defensive complex as a whole may very well end up being overwhelmed. But fighting that kind of war is not our objective here. Firstly, Australia will never face all of China's capabilities alone. They will always have to disperse their forces against the Japanese in the north, potentially the Indians in the west, and the Americans everywhere. Even if they do mass some kind of capability, such as strategic air power, this will only be for a limited time. Thus, the ADF should only expect to face a portion of the PLA. Now, when you are engaging a superpower, that portion may well be a very serious military capability indeed, but nonetheless, it is still only an element. Secondly, we have to remember the wider strategic context. The ADF's operational goal here is not to defeat the PLA alone, but to survive until the Allies are able to redeploy substantial assets to Australia. A2AD offers a very realistic possibility of doing so, including the prevention of amphibious operations in the Indonesian archipelago. So, if Australia fully went down this path and emulated China's A2AD complex, what would the system's vulnerabilities be, and how could these be mitigated? Obviously, if the ADF was able to generate such a mass of anti-ship cruise missile fire, it's very likely that the PLA will look to degrade the wider system before risking something as valuable as a carrier or amphibious strike group equivalent. One of the ways they will surely look to do this is through a blinding effort, to try and rob the ADF of its sensor footprint. The PLA has an anti-satellite capability, however the equatorial orbit does limit their vulnerability. The proposed satellites will never come close to overflying Chinese territory, meaning they will have to be intercepted in orbit. That gives you, the satellite operator, some time to react, meaning you can adjust your orbit to evade. Ensuring Australian intel satellites have more than enough onboard propellant to conduct evasive maneuvers is one way these killersats can be mitigated. Redundancy is the best form of defense when it comes to satellite losses, and even if the PLA did allocate their precious ASAT capability to the satellites owned by the ADF, we could fall back on the US's vast capability. In any case, we must remember that anti-satellite weapons have not been demonstrated in a real-world environment. Yes, the Chinese may have shot down a satellite that was in a polar orbit and flying in a straight line, but that does not mean they have the capability to reliably intercept a satellite in equatorial orbit conducting evasive maneuvers during a war. We should also expect a heavy use of electronic warfare, specifically targeting Jawn. When relying upon open source material, it is basically impossible to know how susceptible Jawn is to electronic warfare techniques, or how advanced China's capability is in this sphere. But one thing we can be sure of is that jamming resistance, called electronic countermeasures, has been built into Jawn from its inception. The very advanced signal processing utilized by the system is one of the primary ways electronic warfare can be combated. In general terms, one of the best ways to mitigate a blinding campaign is to use a mix of different sensors. Even if Jawn's capability has been degraded, its role in the kill chain can be fulfilled by Triton. In fact, Triton could also supplement the satellites in a similar way. Flying at 50,000 feet, the Triton could detect the emissions of the KJ-600 AWACS aircraft at a range in excess of 400 nautical miles, allowing for radio wave refraction. A Triton operating over Indonesia could well detect a hostile carrier strike group equivalent before it entered the ADF's weapon engagement zone, allowing for Jawn to focus its attention on this area. In essence, by having multiple different kinds of sensors operating in multiple different kinds of domains, the ADF can make its sensor footprint much harder to disrupt. In addition to trying to blind the ADF sensors, it's almost certain that the PLA will try and disrupt the A2AD complex with long-range strike systems. The wider system being outlined here is a battle network, the foundations of which are a number of specific facilities across Australia. Air bases, command and control facilities, which are often located at air bases like RAAF Tyndall, and Jaun's wider infrastructure are the things that allow the ADF to have such a potent maritime strike capability. Therefore, striking them before trying to enter the ADF's weapon engagement zone with large-scale naval task forces certainly makes a great deal of sense. Currently, the PLA has a very large ballistic missile arsenal. However, very few Chinese systems have the range to effectively threaten Australia, obviously excluding the ICBMs that are only used in China's nuclear forces. The vast majority of their tactical arsenal, such as the DF-11, DF-12, DF-16 and DF-21, are short to medium range systems, with maximum ranges of less than 2,500 kilometers. Unless these systems were forward deployed to the Indonesian archipelago, they pose no realistic threat to ADF infrastructure. The primary tactical ballistic missile that does potentially pose a threat to Australia is the intermediate range Dongfeng 26. Introduced in 2016, the DF-26 is a two-stage, solid-fueled, road-mobile ballistic missile with a range of around 4,000 kilometers. It's 14 meters long, 1.4 meters in diameter, and weighs some 20 tons. Its warhead is housed in a finned maneuverable re-entry vehicle, and Western analysts estimate its CEP, or circular error probable, a general estimation of accuracy, as 150 to 450 meters. If this evaluation is accurate, then the DF-26 is not really capable of precision strikes. Just as a point of comparison, the JDAM's CEP is 5 meters. This lack of precision accuracy means the DF-26 has to be fired en masse in order to neutralize something like an airbase. Even with a CEP of 200 meters, a volley of 40 missiles are very likely to strike the intended target. By 2020, 3 DF-26 brigades had been identified, each equipped with 12 to 18 launchers. Total stocks of weapons are thought to be around 200, although the PLA is constantly increasing the size of its stockpile. As can be seen, in its current iteration, the PLA's ballistic missile capability does not really pose a major threat to Australia's military infrastructure. Based at Hainan Island, DF-26 batteries could, given what we know about the system, just barely strike RAAF Darwin, which is just over 4,000 kilometers away. Tyndall would appear to be out of reach. The PLA could forward deploy DF-26 batteries to its South China Sea bases in the Spratly Islands, which would bring RAAF Darwin, Tyndall, Curtin and Learmouth within range, but these islands are very small and ballistic missiles are large. Each DF-26 weighs 20 tons. Thus, logistically sustaining a persistent or large-scale missile bombardment from these forward bases would be difficult. Another issue is the fact that these forward positions are well within the RAAF strike radius. An F-35A strike package equipped with the JASSM-ER could readily strike these forward positions, and on these small artificial islands there is nowhere to hide. All of this assumes these positions have escaped the attention of US strategic air power. The Spratly Islands are a long way from mainland China, and it will be hard to defend them from standoff strike. Therefore, we can conclude that, in its current iteration, China's tactical ballistic missile arsenal only poses a moderate threat to the ADF's northern bases. Generally speaking, it is optimized to strike targets along the first island chain. The use of first-generation hypersonic glide vehicles will not appreciably change this evaluation, given the range limitations. Nonetheless, the development of newer, intermediate-range ballistic missiles that pose a more substantial threat over the next 5 to 10 years is certainly possible. The other major form of long-range strike system available to the PLA is its cruise missiles, specifically the CJ-10 family. Essentially the Chinese version of the Tomahawk, the CJ-10 is a subsonic, long-range land attack cruise missile. Its air-launched range is thought to be approximately 2,000 kilometers. It deploys an inertial and satellite navigation system, allowing for a CEP of 5 to 10 meters, giving the weapon a precision strike capability. The missile can be deployed by aircraft, specifically the H-6K bomber, each of which can deploy a payload of 6 missiles. Thus, on paper, the H-6K does pose a very dangerous threat to Australia's northern bases. If refueled, it could strike RAAF Learmouth, Curtin, Tyndall and Darwin. Nevertheless, the major issue the H-6K faces is its vulnerability to fighter defences. Although the H-6 may have been upgraded, it is still, essentially, a 1950s era Tu-16 Badger, which makes its speed low and its signature large. Forewarned by Allied signals intelligence, a refueled flight of F-35As could quite readily intercept the H-6K formation before it reached its launch positions. The PLAAF could just barely provide fighter cover out to this range by heavily relying on tankers, but because of the F-35's very low signature, any escorting fighters will struggle to detect them before they are in a position to engage the bombers. Even a whole regiment will be mission killed the second an air-to-air missile shot is detected, as all will be forced to drop their weapons and become defensive, meaning a very small number of defensive fighters could have a disproportionate effect. The threat the F-35 poses will only increase with the introduction of the long-ranged AIM-260. Finally, even if the weapons are launched, a CJ-10 will be very susceptible to the F-35s themselves. Although the H-6K threat is probably a manageable one for Australia, there are some longer-ranged weapon systems under development, such as air-launched ballistic missiles, that do make the bomber more credible. The CJ-10 is also available in surface-launched variants. It is deployed by the PLAN's modern destroyer classes, such as the Type 52D and Type 55 cruiser, which is another reason why the ADF needs to be able to engage those formations at long range. There is a subclass of the Type 93 Shang-class nuclear submarine that can deploy the CJ-10, the Type 93G, 3 of which are probably in service. If one of these vessels were to approach reasonably close to Northern Australia, undetected, they could launch a CJ-10 volley that could plausibly threaten any of the ADF's major northern bases. Therefore, the PLA's long-range strike capability as it currently stands, and as it is likely to be through to 2020, poses a moderate risk to the ADF's northern bases. Australia's geography and the sheer range required to strike the ADF's bases from mainland China effectively insulates the nation from the majority of the PLA's long-range capability. The Chinese are probably unable to strike Northern Australia with sufficient mass to pose a serious threat to the integrity of the nation's maritime defences. The deployment of near-term future systems, such as hypersonic glide vehicles, is unlikely to change that metric. Nevertheless, the PLA is certainly capable of conducting reasonably limited strikes on Northern Australia with both cruise and ballistic missiles. While these strikes may lack the mass to pose a critical threat, they could very plausibly disrupt the operations of Australia's critical air bases for a period of hours or days, allowing the deployment of much more dangerous naval task forces. With operations at RAAF Tyndall and Darwin disrupted for 36 hours, a carrier strike group can approach nearly 1,000 nautical miles, bringing it to within range of both the carrier air group and the task force's cruise missiles. Thus, the ADF must harden its northern basing infrastructure. This can be achieved by the improvement of hardened aircraft shelters, the use of dummy shelters, and additional fuel and ammunition bunkerage. In fact, the dispersal of ammunition bunkers to other sites may be warranted, as long as such a level of dispersal did not unduly disrupt airbase operations. Investing more heavily in local repair capabilities is another method by which an airbase can be hardened, ensuring that when the base does take a hit, any damage can be quickly addressed. The ADF could even consider the construction of very basic reserve airfields, which could be used as alternate facilities in a crisis, at least in the Northern Territory. This is an approach taken by the United States in Guam, although certainly the threat faced there is far higher. One of the most effective ways the ADF can defend its northern bases from long-range strike systems is simply by the acquisition of a wide-area air defense system with a terminal ballistic missile defense capability. The ADF has lacked a wide-area ground-based air defense system for decades. Currently, the Norwegian NASAMS air defense system is being introduced into service. A development of the surface-launched AMRAAM program, NASAMS is a lightweight, reasonably short-range air defense system that is ideal for the protection of deployed forces from threats including attack helicopters, fixed-wing strike aircraft, and drones. It is a very large improvement over the RBS-70. The system uses the same air-to-air missiles as the RAAF, allowing for the different services to use the same pool of weapons. Launched from the surface, an AIM-120D may have a total range of 25 to 30 kilometers. It would provide some limited point defense capability against cruise missiles and naval fighters. The 2020 Strategic Update outlined a requirement for high-speed and ballistic missile defense capability for deployed forces, including some $23 billion in funding. Currently, the most widely used Western Wide Area ballistic and air defense system is Patriot. Although nearly 40 years old, in its PAC-3 iteration, Patriot is a highly capable terminal ballistic missile defense system. It is operated by 18 different nations, including Japan and South Korea, and would appear to be the logical choice for wide-area air and ballistic missile defense. Nonetheless, there may be more suitable options. Under the Mid-Range Capability Program, the US Army is developing a new mid-range fires battery which could be in service by 2024. Called the Typhon, this new system is built around a number of containerized launch cells, similar in dimension to the Mark 41 vertical launch system. These are arranged on a typical semi-trailer, which when not in operational configuration are stored horizontally, in a similar way to the HIMARS system. A typical battery will contain 4 launchers, each with 4 vertical launch cells, a battery operations center, and a single Humvee for support. The Typhon can then deploy any of the major missile systems currently operational with the USN. The primary air defense missile will be the SM-6 long-range surface-to-air missile. Quickly showing itself to be one of the most versatile weapon systems in contemporary warfare, the dual-mode SM-6 is one of the most capable air defense missiles operational. Equipped with an active radar seeker, the SM-6 can engage targets well over the radar horizon. Its current maximum range is something in excess of 150 nautical miles. The weapon is the US Navy's premier terminal ballistic missile defense system and can even strike surface targets. The SM-6 Block 1B is currently under development. The new version will use the SM-3 Block 2A's 21-inch diameter rocket motor, giving the weapon hypersonic velocity and an even larger range. This new motor is specifically designed to enhance the weapon's ability to engage ballistic missile threats, including hypersonic glide vehicles. With the SM-6 on board, the Typhon will be one of the most capable ground-based air defense systems in the world, absolutely on par with the Russian S-400. Finally, as the system will essentially be able to utilize the same weapons as the Mark 41 VLS, it will deploy the Tomahawk, allowing for theater-wide ground-based precision strike. For the ADF, the Typhon could kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Wide area air defense, including over-the-horizon missile engagement and ballistic missile defense, are all taken care of by the SM-6, and the very same battery can serve as a Tomahawk launch platform, increasing the volume of anti-ship cruise missile fire the ADF can generate. The battery also doesn't use its own radar system, but is rather designed to be plugged into a wider fire control complex. This means fire control could be provided by CEA Technologies' modular CFAR AESA radar that is already in service with the Australian Army and Royal Australian Navy, or even other platforms such as Wedgetail and F-35. Just like NASAMS, Typhon will be able to pool its missiles with another service, simplifying logistics and upgrade paths. As the Navy upgrades its missiles, so will the Army, both in one joint program. Given how mobile the Typhon is, essentially the same as a HIMARS battery, it will be just as useful defending deployed forces as it would Australia's northern bases. Even 4 batteries would provide the ADF with an extremely capable ground-based air and ballistic missile defense complex that would greatly mitigate the threat of the PLA's long-range strike systems, all in addition to acting as a land-based Tomahawk battery. We could even feasibly see the introduction of the active radar homing ESSM Block 2 in future. Given the unprecedented access to US technology delivered by the AUKUS agreement, the ADF has a real opportunity to invest in a truly world-class ground-based air defense capability from the ground floor. Obviously, the doctrinal concept, weapons and platforms outlined here are not the only way the ADF can approach this new and dangerous strategic epoch, but embracing the A2AD concept of operations, as the PLA have already developed, is certainly a plausible option. By focusing on weapons and sensors like the LRASM and imaging satellites, rather than platforms like additional ships and fighter squadrons, the ADF can rapidly deploy these new capabilities. Although the cost of this wider defensive complex was not assessed here, it is certainly achievable given the current budgetary environment, especially considering the fact that so many elements of the A2AD kill chain are already in place. In fact, rather than something revolutionary, we can think of this concept of operations as a mere evolution of the ADF's traditional doctrine, dominating the sea-air gap. The major difference here is the vastly greater area the ADF will be able to deny by combining long-range strike systems with pervasive sensor networks. Such a complex could even be used to defend Australia's friends in the region. Certainly, we should not delude ourselves as to the ability of the ADF, even if armed and equipped as envisaged here, to take on the entire Chinese Navy of 2030 alone. But, as this argument has hopefully outlined, the A2AD concept of operations can be fully integrated within a wider allied strategy for fighting a high-intensity war with China. If the unthinkable were to happen, and Beijing decided to initiate a war of aggression in the region, something that should seem all the more plausible to all of us after Russian actions in Ukraine, Australia will have its place alongside its Western allies, one that may be of critical importance. Rather than being a minor nation in a far-flung corner of the world, Australia, much like it was during World War II, again sits in a position of geopolitical consequence. That makes the nation both significant and potentially vulnerable. From Australia's shores, the Western Allies may well be able to dominate Southeast Asia, and by doing so could decide the fate of a global conflict. This reality is only growing more vivid to both Washington and Beijing. Whatever path the ADF walks down, the stark reality is the nation is facing a period of dire strategic risk. War. The prospect of serious, sustained, high-intensity war in the Indo-Pacific is an idea Australians must come to terms with, and something the ADF must be prepared for. The current investment in platforms is applaudable. The Royal Australian Navy of the 2040s will be one of serious global significance, in many ways comparable to the major European powers. But 2042 may just end up being too late. It has been 13 years since the 2009 Defence White Paper, where the Force 2030 concept was first envisaged. We are now only 8 years from that time, and very few of the capabilities outlined will have been achieved by the end of this decade. Critical systems, like the future submarine, have been neglected and delayed by successive governments of both parties, leading to a potential 50-year service life for the Collins. In the end, the AUKUS submarine probably will end up being the far better choice, but this is a decision that should have been made in 2011, not 2021. The ADF needs a fundamental paradigm shift in the way it approaches procurement. New capabilities need to be fielded in years rather than decades. This may well be easier said than done, but the global strategic circumstance ultimately does not care how much organisational or bureaucratic friction there is within the Australian government and military. We simply need to be faster, and at least by focusing on weapons and sensors, rather than new classes of platforms, with A2AD we can be fast, avoiding the inevitable pitfalls of platform design and production. The US alliance gives us many exceptional opportunities. By jointly developing many of these systems, even those that may not be absolutely perfect for Australian requirements, we can alleviate these problems. But we need to act now, or history might not wait.